So what do we think we're playing at? Sitting here, minds totally mixed up, confused, upset, tangled up, knotted up by a few 1,000-year-old words. What are we doing? Is that something useful or even sensible to be doing? It wasn't what Bodhidharma told us to do when he came from the West. He didn't tell us to pickle old koans for 1,000 years, then chew on them and swallow them. So what are we doing? Well, we are doing something somewhat strange and artificial. It's a device. It's something which has been invented. And we're doing it because indeed it has proven useful. It's proven itself over the centuries. We could say it's something invented by the Chinese. Bodhidharma didn't bring it to China, this method. But actually we could also say the Buddha practiced it. If we consider the life story of the Buddha, I'm sure all of you know, he became suddenly very deeply touched by the questions of existence, of life and death, of suffering. And it's easy to say that was his koan. What is suffering? What is human existence? And he didn't know. He was struck by doubt, a very deep sense of not knowing. And he couldn't find the answers in his life in the palace. And so he left, according to legend, left his wife and baby. This was so important, so overwhelming, he had to find out. He had to solve this. This was not a small doubt, this was a great doubt. This was something which really drove him. And for many years, seeking, including some quite extreme ascetic practices, nearly died. This was something which took over him. But then, eventually, he found a breakthrough. He did find it possible to break through and find a way to understand human life and existence and suffering, and be at ease with it. So, you could say that the Chinese invented or maybe reinvented or rediscovered this method. The Buddha, we could say, practiced it. Any answer that came to him, he wasn't satisfied. He was taught many techniques of meditation and ascetic practices. He debated with many philosophers, but he didn't accept any of these answers. It would have been very tempting to do so, wouldn't it? Ah, yes, this makes sense. But it didn't satisfy. He knew that just some philosophy, some transient mental state, was not it. Somehow what was required was a revolution in his sense of existence. And that was the breakthrough that he eventually made, sitting under the bo tree. Complete change in the way he related to the world. And now, yes, I see. Ah. So with these koans, in a sense, we are indeed in the footsteps of the Buddha, treading a path that's been trodden not only by him, but by many of the masters too. not using these particular koans, but that's okay. You're using a koan which is meaningful to you, at least on some level. But most of you are also discovering that it goes beyond the initial meaningfulness of the words. It touches matters of your own being in the world, how it is to be you, how it is to be in the world the way it is. The koan triggers you into noticing the attitudes and views that you hold, and which you believe to be in some way your truths, or your facts, or your history, or your personality. And you reflect on these. And some of these you find, oh, well, I assumed it was so, but it turns out just to be a story I told myself. Huh. Oh, it turns out to be a story that someone else told me and I believed it. Huh. And we find we can't trust our sense of knowing who we are. We find we can't trust our sense of knowing what the world is, what existence is. Because somewhere along the line, we've picked up an idea, a story, a sense of knowing, and it turns out we picked up a provisional idea. It had some usefulness in a particular situation. It was an approximation, but it doesn't fully bear up to close examination. And so as we progress with investigating the koan, instead, as we might imagine, us getting nearer to a resolution, getting more satisfied that we're nearly there, we find ourselves getting further away. We start off with just a little puzzle of a few words on a piece of paper, and the rest of our life pretty clear and sorted. And as time goes by, the words on the page, even if we've sort of sorted them in an intellectual way, we've explored various ideas. But alongside this, our sense of ourselves has become much shakier, because we've spotted that we've just been living a web of stories. Some of them comforting stories. Some of them rather uncomfortable stories, but we've clung on to them for some reason. They fitted. We maybe leaned on them as an excuse. Or maybe we just believed them as a truth. But the web of stories starts to disintegrate. And the so-called doubt sensation, this rather difficult phrase, the so-called doubt sensation increases. Instead of diminishing, as we might expect from a successful investigation, it increases. More and more so-called fixities of our existence crumble away as no longer fixed. That attitude I hold about myself, it's transparent, it's seen through, it's just an idea. And it has a certain degree of resonance with the way I've been, but it's not an ultimate truth. We need to allow the koan to work on us in these ways. We don't want to limit its scope. It needs to be allowed to prod at each corner of us. It's uncomfortable not knowing. And that discomfort can both take us away from the process as we get a bit afraid and troubled by it, but But it can also take us deeper into the process, because not knowing means you need to look more closely. But the problem is, the more closely we look, we find we don't know that either. The doubt gets bigger. And we find ourselves, in a sense, desperately searching. Desperately wanting to know, needing to know, becomes more important than anything else, but not having a way to know. And so we're on the lookout, 100%. Every phenomena that arises in awareness is noticed. Tension extremely sharp. But nothing is attached to, because nothing satisfies us. Nothing resolves this doubt, this discomfort. And so we have 101% attention. Still everything is experienced. It can become totally overwhelming. You must solve this. Nothing else matters. And in this state, quite often people will just simply continue sitting. Why bother moving? Because a bell has gone. A bell is just a sound. That doesn't help me. A meal bell. Doesn't matter. Carry on sitting. Don't need food. Japanese teacher Hakuin is reputed for having been in this state, walking through the town, just bumping into people, bumping into lampposts. Flo tells me that people in this state are not much used to her in the kitchen. Jobs don't get done. You might start cutting an onion, but you realise that's not the answer to your koan. The onion remains unfinished. Jobs don't get done. So this is a very strange state. And as Hakuin found out, it's not one which really works in everyday life in the marketplace. Which is why, typically, you can only really engage in this practice in the deepest way in a supported environment like a retreat. There are ways of practicing with koans off retreat, but the intensity really can't be there normally. But in this environment, where you've got some trust that the place ticks over and works. Maybe you're not cutting the onions very well, but they'll get done. Someone will do them. Meals will appear, if you need them at the time. The place will be kept warm if it's cold. That's all you need to know, really. So you can just be here without fussing and worrying. And actually, if you miss several meals in a row, we might even save some food for you, or even bring it over here to you. It works out, so you're supported. And knowing that, sensing that, you've got the possibility of just plunging deeper and deeper. Partly sort of by choice, because you want to persist with the practice, and partly there's no choice. You've just got to do it because you can't be left not knowing. The Buddha couldn't have just given up and gone back to the palace and said, "No, it didn't work out." It's not an option. There can be times when the practice weakens. Somehow you do attach to some phenomenon. Maybe you fall for believing you found an answer, or maybe you just got distracted or overtired. So Master Sheng Yen used to say that when you're in the great doubt, it can go two different ways. The commonest way is that it dissipates. It slips away. It slips away to small doubt, or even to complacency. But if sustained, it can also do what he would call shattering, or exploding. It's like an explosion. And these are really just words which indicate the suddenness and maybe the drama of it, because it can be very dramatic and sudden and surprising and unexpected. But actually not always dramatic in that sense. It might just be, yeah, I see. Might be no more dramatic than that. But indeed it might be a great big explosion of emotion and noise. The shock of seeing things differently can be so great. So persist with your koan. Let it persist in its investigation of you. If you find a hint of dissipation, pick it up and persist. Don't let the practice slip away from you, having put the effort into it so far. If the koan slips away, pick it up. If the mind wanders, bring it back. And you may feel this shift into a more total absorption in the koan. Another way of saying that you and the koan have become one. There isn't sort of a practitioner sitting here saying, oh yes, I've got that koan I'm supposed to be doing on that koan over there. I'll have a look at it sometime. No, it's not that. You've become totally one with the koan, but actually almost not the koan itself. At some point the words of the koan are not really the point of the practice. The point of the practice is this not knowing, this sort of uncomfortable void, waiting to be filled by knowledge but failing to be filled by knowledge. Our habit is to fill lack of knowledge with knowledge, even if it's an approximation, even if it's just something that will make do for now. But in this process that seems not to be an available option. The intensity of our gaze, the intensity of our attention, means that we don't fall for approximations. We think, no, that's not it. That doesn't satisfy me. Don't allow yourself to be satisfied in this way. Have a hunger for knowing, but don't be satisfied with half-knowings. So what is this shattering? What is a breakthrough? What did the Buddha discover? Well, we can only really talk about this in metaphor, because there isn't really the language to convey something like this. But the metaphors can give us maybe some idea, and maybe some idea of how radical it is. If you remember, the Buddha's enlightenment phrase was, house builder, I've seen through you. The rafters have fallen down and will be no more. It's one way of phrasing it, a metaphor. What's it a metaphor? What is it indicating? It's indicating his world of mental constructions, the house, the beams. He'd realised he was living in a world of mental constructions. He wasn't living in the world that actually is. He was inhabiting a world that he'd constructed and knew to be so. But it turns out that knowing was just an assumption, was just an idea. It didn't actually fit the reality as he perceived it. As he continued his sharp attention, as he continued, he suddenly saw things differently. He saw beyond his own mental constructions. He saw them as constructions and not as fact. What are these mental constructions? Do we understand that term? Because we all have them, you see. Largely our mind is preoccupied with the world of objects, of relationships between objects, of interactions, of names, of differentiation, duality and multiplicity. But all of that is a mental construction. What? What does that mean? It's not so much that there aren't any phenomena, but our joining them together into objects is an activity that we've done. As you see where the language lets you down. Doesn't quite make sense, but there is this sense in which we see things and we relate to them as things, as objects. But that very objectification comes from us. Indeed, another person could look in the same direction and not see the same thing, because their mind has a different history and different preferences and different ways of interpretation. Now, for common everyday objects that we have a shared experience of and we have names for, then we're likely to come up with the same name, but maybe a little bit of a different understanding of it, but still the same name. So we think we're having the same thing, and we think there is a thing. But actually, if we just look behind the surface a bit, this thing turns out to be rather ephemeral. Indeed, a construction which can be deconstructed. And we usually use metaphors again at this point. And quite a nice one to think about is a river. Or we could think about the little stream that we have here. And pretty much we all know what we mean by a river or a stream. Quite possibly you're visualising one now as I've said the word. Maybe you're standing by a river and I come up to you and say, "Where's the river?" And you just point. There's the river. I say, "Ah, okay." And we chat for a bit. And I say, "Where's the river now?" And you point again. And I say, "Oh, no, well, no, because that river's it's flowed away, it's over there now. This is another one, isn't it?" "Oh. Same river? Oh, how does that work?" Oh, maybe you're not talking about the water. Are you talking about the riverbed? Is that what you mean by the river? Or the banks? Take the water away, there's still a river, is there?" "No. You'd have water for it to be a river." "Oh, but the water went away. I saw it go." "More water's come." This is getting a bit confusing. So it's not the banks, it's the water, but it's not any particular water. It's just that there is water that makes it a river. Oh. So, So the river isn't a thing because the thing that you pointed at first is out of sight and you still say that it's the river. It's the process of flow. That's what we call a river. It's not a thing. We can't pick it up. We can't hold it. It doesn't stay the same. It's in its very nature that it doesn't stay the same. If it stayed the same, we'd call it a pond. It has to be flowing, so it has to be changing for it to be called a river. So our sense of this as an object is rather a strange object. Because does it really have a beginning? I know little trickles of raindrops run over the grass, fall into a depression, possibly become a stream, possibly join other streams. So really our idea of a river is just a definition of it's where two larger streams join together to make something large enough and we'll call it a river. And where it hits the sea we'll call it the sea. But in between we'll call it a river. As long as it's flowing, but if it stops flowing we won't call it a river. So it's a sort of a mental convenience to think we know of a river as an object. But its very nature is that it's changing. And its very nature is that it's sort of constructed by definitions. There must be flow, there must be a certain width, and so on. Otherwise it's not a river. So it's very much a mental shorthand, a convenience, something that we know of as a river. But it doesn't relate to any one object. I hope you're following this to some extent, because it's significant, but it is confusing because we're so used to just handling objects. And the river is a particularly interesting metaphor to use because the nature of change is built into the definition of river, and therefore almost by definition it isn't an object even though we treat it as such. It's not something fixed, static, that we can label and say this is the river. It has to be running away from us, or it isn't a river. But this process of change applies to everything that we might call an object. The change isn't a flow in the same way as of a river necessarily, well it might be. It's the change of impermanence. Everything is changing. There isn't a single thing which is staying the same. So even objects which we assume some solidity and permanence, in their own way they're also flowing. They're in transition between where they came from and where they're going to. That transition might be quite brief in the case of something like a mayfly or a raindrop. It could be hundreds or thousands of years in the case of something like a lump of metal. But it's in transition. It wasn't always so, and it shan't always be so. That bell shan't always be so. It'll change. It probably won't rust. It may tarnish. It may get crushed by a falling beam. It may get melted when in a few million years the sun swells up into a red giant and engulfs the earth. It certainly won't always be the same as it is now. Its time scale is quite long, but it's actually flowing. Can you see it? It's moving very slowly. Some things are moving more quickly, but nothing is staying. But we construct it as something staying because that's convenient. We know where it is. We know how hard to hit it. We know where to put it away at the end of the retreat, and we know where to find it when we arrive for the next retreat. Things seem predictable, and that's convenient. But actually, it's only an approximation. The reality isn't so. That reality isn't so for anything, including our own mental worlds, which we've neatly compartmentalized in many ways. We've created those compartments. We've constructed our own view of the world. We've constructed ideas. We've constructed facts. We've constructed histories. We've constructed relationships and viewpoints and prejudices and attitudes. And that's the world we inhabit. The Buddha's discovery was there's a world, if you like, behind all that. The rafters can fall down. We can do without that world we've constructed. In fact, we're better off without it. Because it ties us in knots. It upsets us. It confuses us. It limits us. And the shattering is that moment when you just suddenly see the constructions and the release of the constructions. And suddenly you're inhabiting a different world. you might call it a purer, cleaner world. It's clear of the obstructions of old wooden beams and lumps of metal you might trip over and so on. I think John liked to quote a Tibetan teacher who called it the mind being clean clear. And then the doubt isn't there. The doubt can indeed drop away, because now you know. It's not a knowing of naming of objects. You're not back into creating categories and constructions. It's just, this is so. This. I know. There's no doubt. Before then, you were encountering the constructions, and although not seeing through them as constructions, nevertheless not feeling fully comfortable with them. When you looked at them closely enough, you could maybe see the sense how you'd constructed them from ideas and from history and from thoughts and from anxieties. Maybe not quite ready to let them go, but then maybe you could see that some of them could let go or were let go. But what you hadn't realised until this point was that every single one of them was a construction and could be let go and was let go. And that is indeed a revolution in your way of relating to the world. Probably for the first time in your life, direct contact with the nature of existence. The phrase is seeing the nature. Seeing the nature of emptiness is the fuller phrase, and emptiness being this technical word for changing from seeing the world as being objects of some fixity to being flow, change. That is its essence, that is its nature. Seeing that, realising that in a deep, total way, frees you from attachment, because there is nothing, no thing to which you can attach. How can you attach to a river? Can you pick it up and take it home with you? Nonsense. Can you stop it flowing with your hand? You can't do it with a river, and you can't do it with anything else either. Can't be done. And it becomes so clear that it can't be done that you give up all thought of doing it. You give up all frustration at not being able to do it. It's just so obvious. So the suffering of attachment and aversion drops away, because it just becomes a totally pointless game. It's just so obvious. So tying ourselves in knots with thousand-year-old words does have a point. It's not a point which is easily reached because of the tendency of the mind to wander, to lose its focus, to become dissipated, to be unwilling to give up attachments. All of these get in the way. But if we can overcome these, if we can persist with the practice and pick it up again when we lose it, and pick it up again when we lose it again, and keep it moving rather than stagnating by being unwilling to challenge our knowns, if we can keep it going, we can indeed find this mind which is totally 100% attentive, totally experiencing every phenomenon presenting to it, and not attaching to a single one, not claiming any as an answer. And in that total clarity, it sees these constructions, as creations of the mind, none of them as ultimate truths. They're just creations of the mind, which you probably created in some way to cope with the world, to console yourself, to find a way of getting by, sometime in the past. And you see them as such, and let them go. And you drop into just being with, just this, becoming part of the flow, not resisting, pointless to resist, the nature of existence, at ease, free. This practice can take you there. It can fail to get you there because the mind is tricky to train. But it's possible to take you there. And this is why we persist in this rather special environment of retreat, where we've got the best opportunity to deepen this practice and take it all the way. As I say, in other places, other environments, it's probably not possible because you have to do a certain amount of housekeeping work, relating. These things break the concentration. But in this context, actually, you can just simply drop in to the doubt sensation and stay there. And if you don't turn up for work period because you're stuck in the doubt sensation, no one's going to come and drag you away. And if you don't turn up for meal, no problem. We won't let you waste away on the cushion. It'll all work out. Now I suppose if every single one of you drops into total doubt sensation all at once, I'd be busy ferrying food around. But that's not the way it usually goes. Because some people's minds are stickier than others. But often it's the ones who imagine themselves with the sticky minds are the ones who actually break through. And the ones who rather secretly think that they're the best and they're going to get there first, they carry on thinking that for a very long time. So don't get tangled up in that sort of game. Wholeheartedly engage with the koan. Totally experience the engagement. Allow it to touch you wherever it touches you. And be open to experiencing that. It's not just an intellectual challenge, it's a bodily challenge, it's an emotional challenge. Experience every part of it. Because it's in this total experience that you've got the possibility of seeing through your habitual tendencies and constructions. If you only half see them, they're just objects that you walk around, treat as shadows, treat as tools. But if you directly confront each mental phenomenon, then you can see through it and beyond it. And actually it's not really that difficult. You just have to be totally present now, for half a second is longer than necessary, and it's clear. Cultivate the doubt very deeply. Master Sheng Yen used to say, small doubt, small enlightenment. Great doubt, great enlightenment. Are there different enlightenments? What did he mean by that? Well, don't get too tangled up in that, but there is the sense in which if you do have a moment of seeing, an enlightenment experience, there are different strengths of the experience, different durations. Not quite different degrees of clarity, but there are differences, for example, in that if you only visit it very briefly, then you return and it was something happened, very definite, very clear. But what else? Whereas if you visit it and maybe stay there a long time, and maybe look around and really realise the total enormity of it, and also see the stupidity of some of your vexations, and they're dissolved on the spot. If you only visit briefly, maybe only one or two vexations come under the searchlight, and you return and most of them are still there. But if you have a great enlightenment, many different obstructions and vexations can be permanently dissolved because they're just unsustainable in this context. So even when you return from that state into your everyday confused state, you're not going to fall for that one again, because you know it's unsustainable, it's nonsense. But still, other vexations missed out on the cleansing, shall we say. They're going to trip you up. There's many more still to work on, so practice continues. But it's still worthwhile visiting this place. It lets you know there's another way of relating to the world, and indeed it may cleanse some of your significant vexations, obstructions for you, because in that place they are seen through and dissolved. So make careful use of the opportunity for practice. Any tendency to slip away and daydream, be firm with yourself, pick up the method. Any tendency to create sort of no-go areas in the mind which you're not going to allow to be investigated, don't do that. Any tendency to give yourself time off, to be easy on yourself, it's wasting time, it's wasting opportunity. All of these self-judgments that we carry, these assumptions about our place in the world, our understanding of the world itself, it's all something which we've invented. Pretty clever, aren't we? But maybe a bit too clever sometimes. Trip ourselves up. In this state of not knowing, these knowns become not knowns. The mind becomes cleaner and clearer, ready for that breakthrough. You can cultivate that mind, you're already doing it. Persevere and persist.